Rome, a civilization remembered for its marble temples, gladiator games, and emperors draped in gold. But behind the grandeur, behind the applause of the Colosseum and the triumphs of legions, existed a truth the Romans never wanted written into history. A truth of chains, blood, and silence. Millions lived and died as slaves, not just laborers, but bodies bought and sold, exploited in ways so shocking that even Roman historians wrote only in whispers. Their lives were currency, their suffering entertainment, and their dignity erased by an empire that thrived on their silence. These are the secrets of Roman slavery, the side they tried to hide, but that cannot remain buried forever. This is the forbidden story of chains, power, and silence. Rome, the eternal city. To later generations, it stood as the jewel of civilization, a place of senators debating in marble halls, generals returning in triumph, emperors crowned with laurels. But what most modern eyes miss when they gaze upon its ruins is the foundation beneath that glory: human suffering. Every stone of the Colosseum, every brick of an aqueduct, every harvest cart that entered the gates behind them, all were hands in chains. Slavery in Rome was not an ugly secret whispered in shadows. It was the backbone of society, present in every home, every farm, every marketplace. Unlike later systems of slavery that divided the world by race, Roman slavery was indiscriminate. Anyone could become a slave: Greek philosophers, captured kings, Celtic warriors, Jewish rebels, African farmers. War was Rome's harvest, and human beings were its crop. When a Roman army triumphed in a foreign land, its soldiers looted treasures, but their most valuable spoils were people. A single campaign could flood Rome's markets with tens of thousands of captives. These men, women, and children were paraded behind generals in victory processions before being dragged to auction. In the marketplace, they were stripped naked, chalk smeared across their bodies to highlight their muscles or cover their scars. Merchants shouted their attributes like livestock traders: strong worker, beautiful girl, skilled cook, literate Greek boy. A child's tears or a mother's pleading made no difference. They were commodities now. The prices told their own story. A simple field hand might be sold for a few hundred denarii. A young girl of beauty could fetch the price of an entire estate. A skilled Greek tutor, capable of teaching a Roman child philosophy, could cost more than a farm. Rome measured humanity in coin, and coin bought more than bodies, it bought absolute power. In Roman law, a slave was res, property, an object. They could not marry in a legal sense, they could not own possessions. Their testimony in court was worthless unless obtained through torture, since Romans assumed no slave would tell the truth freely. Even their children belonged to their master. Families existed only until the master decided otherwise. Consider the horror of a mother watching her son sold away, knowing she would never see him again. Or a husband sent to the mines while his wife remained in the city, forced into another man's bed. These separations were not accidents, they were part of the machinery. Divide families, erase bonds, and the slaves remain easier to control. The labor they performed was relentless. On rural estates, slaves plowed the soil from dawn until nightfall, their backs bent under the Mediterranean sun. Overseers with whips ensured no one slowed. In cities, they served in kitchens, carried water, tended fires, cleaned baths, and built monuments. Skilled slaves worked as accountants, scribes, or doctors, their talents enriching men who treated them as possessions. But the darkest labor was in the mines. Few places in the empire were as feared as the silver mines of Spain or the stone quarries of Italy. Here, men and women toiled in darkness, inhaling dust, chained together as they dug through rock. Food was scarce, air poisonous, beatings constant. Survival was rare. Ancient writers admitted openly, sending a slave to the mines was a death sentence. Yet Rome's cruelty was not only in labor, it was in spectacle. Gladiators were almost all slaves, trained to fight to the death for the amusement of free citizens. The Colosseum, admired today as a wonder of architecture, was also a slaughterhouse for human beings. Men begged for mercy, women were thrown to beasts, and the crowd roared as blood soaked the sand. These victims had once been farmers, soldiers, or children in their homelands, but in Rome, they were nothing more than entertainment. What shocks us most is how normal this all was to Roman eyes. Senators could debate philosophy in the morning and order the flogging of a slave in the afternoon without a second thought. Poets could write verses on love while joking about beating servants. Rome's greatest thinkers, from Aristotle to Cicero, accepted slavery as part of the natural order. To be Roman was to be free only because someone else was not. The city itself was built on this paradox. Rome's streets bustled with grandeur, but behind every senator stood a retinue of slaves carrying his scrolls, cleaning his toga, or fanning him in the heat. Behind every empress stood slaves braiding her hair, polishing her jewelry, or enduring her scorn. Behind every banquet where nobles dined on roasted peacocks and fine wines were slaves cooking in hot kitchens, serving food and cleaning filth when the guests vomited from excess. And always, always there was fear. A slave could be crucified for striking his master, even if in self-defense. A careless word could lead to a whipping that tore flesh to the bone. The chains were not only iron, but psychological, instilling obedience through terror. Rome liked to present itself as a civilization of law, order, and justice. But its justice had limits. For 1/3 of its people, justice did not exist. They were shadows everywhere, essential, and yet denied the dignity of being human. This was the true foundation of Rome's glory. A society raised high on the broken backs of millions, their voices silenced, their suffering forgotten beneath marble and triumph. If the public image of Roman slavery was brutal, the hidden side was even darker. This is the world Rome did not want immortalized in marble or written proudly in law. The forbidden side of slavery was whispered about but rarely recorded, for it exposed the ugliest truths of Roman power. One of the most disturbing aspects was the sexual exploitation of slaves. Roman masters had total ownership of their bodies, and this extended to every imaginable violation. Women were often purchased specifically for their youth and beauty, kept not as companions but as property to be used at will. In the grand villas of senators, in the palaces of emperors, even in the cramped apartments of commoners, slaves were forced into silence as their masters indulged themselves. Refusal was impossible. Resistance meant flogging, mutilation, or death. Male slaves, too, were not spared. Young boys, especially those from Greece or the East, were highly prized for their appearance. Some masters flaunted them at feasts as entertainers, only to abuse them later in private. The line between servant and victim did not exist. A slave was both, trapped in a system that erased their humanity. This hidden world of abuse was normalized, yet never openly admitted in the rhetoric of Roman pride. Another forbidden side was the secret punishments that happened far from public eyes. While crucifixions and executions were spectacles meant to terrify the masses, much cruelty occurred in the shadowed chambers of estates. Masters devised their own punishments, branding the faces of disobedient slaves, cutting tendons to prevent escape, or locking them in dark rooms for days without food. Wealthier Romans employed private torture chambers, where disobedience was crushed before it could spread. Particularly horrifying was the fate of slaves suspected of plotting revolt. Roman law allowed the execution of entire households of slaves if one of them killed their master. In one infamous case, after a wealthy Roman senator was murdered by a single slave, hundreds of innocent slaves and his household men, women, and children were executed in public, their deaths, a warning that the empire valued fear above justice. There were also forbidden markets within the empire where the most vulnerable were sold. These underground slave trades trafficked in children, captured illegally or stolen from poor families. Some were sold into brothels, where their lives were reduced to endless exploitation. Others were trained for roles that demanded absolute obedience. Assassins, poisoners, or spies, used by their masters in political schemes. Even religion was tainted. Slaves often had to serve in temples not out of faith, but because their owners lent them for profit. Some became temple prostitutes, their bodies offered under the guise of ritual. Others were forced to perform tasks considered unclean, handling corpses, cleaning sewers rolls that marked them as permanently polluted. What made these hidden crimes so haunting was their silence. The victims had no voice, no way to record their pain. Their stories survive only in fragments, letters, inscriptions, fleeting mentions by Roman writers who barely concealed their discomfort. The empire prided itself on law and civilization, but behind closed doors, it tolerated horrors that modern society struggles even to imagine. This was the forbidden side of Roman slavery, not just labor, but domination of the body, mind, and soul. A world where cruelty was routine, silence was enforced, and suffering was deliberately erased from the polished image of Rome. Rome's system of slavery seemed unbreakable. It endured for centuries, feeding on conquest and fear. But within its cracks, voices of defiance sometimes rose, reminding the empire that chains could not completely silence the human spirit. The greatest of these voices was Spartacus. A Thracian gladiator, trained to die for sport, Spartacus broke free from his school in Capua with a band of fellow slaves. What began as a desperate escape grew into a rebellion of tens of thousands. Men, women, and children joined him, carrying farm tools and stolen weapons. They defeated Roman armies again and again, shaking the empire to its core. For 2 years, Spartacus's rebellion spread terror through Italy. Roman citizens, used to seeing slaves bow their heads, now saw them marching as soldiers, burning estates, and demanding freedom. But Rome's response was merciless. When Spartacus was finally defeated, 6,000 of his followers were crucified along the Appian Way, their bodies lining the road for miles. The message was unmistakable: resist, and you will die in agony. That rebellion was the largest, but it was not the only one. Across the empire, smaller revolts erupted: slaves who killed their masters, who fled to the mountains, who fought in the forests. Each was crushed, each remembered only briefly before being buried in silence. Rome's machine of terror worked efficiently. Fear was its strongest chain. For the majority, survival meant endurance, not rebellion. Resistance took subtler forms, working slowly, hiding food, feigning illness, or preserving songs and stories from their homelands in whispers. These quiet acts were seeds of identity, ways of saying, "I am more than a possession. I am still human." But Rome sought not only to enslave bodies, it tried to erase souls. Children born into slavery often never knew freedom. They grew up speaking Latin, serving masters, and accepting their place as natural. Generations were consumed in this cycle, until entire lineages vanished without record. The psychological toll was devastating. Imagine being told from birth that your life had no worth beyond labor, that your body was not your own, that your fate could change at a master's whim. Imagine never having the right to choose who to love, where to live, or even what name to carry. This was the silent cruelty of Roman slavery, the erasure of individuality, the crushing of hope. Yet history remembers Rome as a civilization of greatness, not as an empire of chains. Why? Because the voices of slaves were erased. The histories we read were written by the victors, the masters. The cries of the oppressed did not survive, except in fragments: a scratched epitaph on a tombstone, a passing remark in a philosopher's text, a slave's name carved into a household object. These fragments are all that remain of millions of lives. Rome's legacy of slavery did not die with the empire. Centuries later, when European powers began to build their own empires, they looked back to Rome as a model. They imitated its laws, its roads, its architecture, and tragically, its slavery. The transatlantic slave trade, one of the darkest chapters in human history, was not born in a vacuum. It was a shadow of Rome, stretched across time. Even today, we remember Rome for its grandeur: the Colosseum, the legions, the emperors. Tourists walk its ruins and marvel at its achievements. Few pause to think of the hands that built those monuments, the backs whipped raw, the mothers weeping for children lost, the gladiators bleeding in the sand. Rome is celebrated for its genius, but its cruelty is often footnoted, hidden behind the word civilization. The legacy of Roman slavery forces us to confront a hard truth. Greatness is often built on suffering. Empires rise not only with marble and armies, but with chains and blood. And when history glorifies power without acknowledging its victims, it risks repeating the same cycle. Spartacus and his followers may have been crucified, but their defiance lingers. It is a reminder that even in the darkest oppression, the human will to resist cannot be completely destroyed. Every whisper of resistance, every stolen song, every memory of freedom was an act of defiance against an empire that demanded silence. Rome tried to bury the crimes of slavery, but history has a way of remembering. Their forbidden side cannot remain hidden forever. If this hidden side of Roman slavery shocked you, don't let their silence remain unbroken. Like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss the secrets history tried to erase. Share your thoughts in the comments. Which part of Rome's hidden cruelty shocked you the most? Every week, we uncover the darkest truths behind empires, kings, and civilizations that shaped the world. Because history is not just about glory, it's about the voices buried in the shadows.